In early 1969, Dodge built a special version of the Charger to fix its aerodynamic problems at Daytona. It worked better than a stock Charger. Then, 3 months later, Dodge built the Daytona, a car so extreme it made the 500 look like a rough draft. Today, almost nobody remembers the 500 existed. That's a mistake, because the 500 is the car that proves that Daytona was necessary in the first place. Here's the setup. By 1968, NASCAR racing had turned into an arms race between Ford and Chrysler, and the battlefield was a superspeedway. Tracks like Daytona and Talladega, where cars ran flat out above 190 miles an hour for 500 miles at a time. At those speeds, a car's shape stops being a styling decision and starts being a physics problem. And the 1968 Dodge Charger, for all its good looks, had a shape that worked against it. The Charger's signature design elements, the ones that made it a sales hit on the street, were the same ones that killed it on the track. The grille sat recessed nearly 2 inches behind the nose of the car, tucked into a tunnel. It looked aggressive. At race speed, that recessed grille caught air and created drag, like cupping your hand out a car window. The rear window told the same story. The Charger's fastback had a tunnel back design, where the rear glass sat recessed between 2 flying buttresses. It looked sleek from the showroom floor. At 190 miles an hour, that tunnel filled with turbulent low-pressure air, and low pressure over the back of a car means one thing: lift. The rear end wanted to leave the ground exactly when the driver needed it planted. Dodge's engineers didn't need a wind tunnel to tell them this. The drivers told them. Charger pilots on the super speedway circuit were blunt about it in the garage. The Charger looked right and ran hard on short tracks, but on the big super speedways, it simply couldn't keep pace with what Ford was fielding, no matter how much horsepower the engine program threw at it. This was a body problem, not an engine problem, and no amount of horsepower under the hood fixes a car whose rear end wants to leave the pavement at speed. So, for 1969, Dodge built a fix. It wasn't a new car, it was a surgical correction of exactly the 2 problems that were costing them races. Engineers pulled the grille forward and made it flush with the nose, eliminating the recessed tunnel that had been catching air. For the rear window, they didn't design a new piece of glass, they borrowed one. The flush-mounted backlight from the Dodge Coronet, a completely different car in Chrysler's lineup, happened to be almost the exact shape needed to fill in the tunneled back of the Charger and make the rear glass sit flat. It was an unglamorous parts bin solution to a serious problem, and it worked. Dodge called it the Charger 500. The name wasn't about horsepower or the model year. It referred to the number of units Dodge needed to build to make the car legal for NASCAR competition. This is a detail people miss constantly, and it matters because it explains everything about why the car looks the way it does. NASCAR in this era required manufacturers to actually sell a minimum number of a given configuration to the public before it could race, a rule called homologation. Build enough of them and NASCAR treats your race car as a production car everyone can theoretically buy. Dodge's magic number was 500, and so the name Charger 500 wasn't a boast, it was a paperwork requirement. Dodge built exactly enough of these cars to satisfy NASCAR's rulebook, sold them to the public through dealerships, and cleared the car to race. And on paper, it worked exactly as intended. The flush grille cut drag, the flush rear window killed the lift that had been unsettling the car's tail end. Charger 500s went to the 1969 Daytona 500 measurably faster and more stable than the standard Chargers they replaced. For a car built essentially as a bolt-on fix, that's a real engineering win. Dodge diagnosed a specific problem and solved it with the tools already sitting in the corporate parts bin. It's worth pausing on how strange this homologation system was, because it's the reason a car this significant could be built in such small numbers and still be street legal. NASCAR wasn't just regulating engines and safety equipment, it was regulating body shape itself, on the logic that if a manufacturer wanted a racing advantage from aerodynamics, ordinary buyers needed access to that same shape at a dealership. It's a rule built for an era when stock car still meant something close to its literal definition. That's why the Charger 500's 500 units weren't a marketing flourish or an artificial scarcity play like a modern limited edition might be. They were the minimum legal threshold, no more, no fewer, and Dodge built exactly that many because building more would have cost money with no racing benefit, and building fewer would have gotten the car disqualified before it ever turned a lap. But here's where the story turns, and it's the part almost nobody outside serious Mopar circles knows. The Charger 500 won races. It did not dominate. Ford's Aero cars, first the Torino Talladega, then the Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2, were still faster in a straight line on the biggest tracks. Dodge's engineers ran the numbers after Daytona and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The 500's fixes had solved the Charger's worst problems, but the car's fundamental shape, a flat, blunt front end pushing a wall of air, and a body simply not built for sustained triple-digit speeds, was still holding it back. A flush grille helps. It doesn't rewrite the laws of physics for a car never designed to slice through air at 200 miles an hour. This is the moment that explains why the Charger 500 disappeared from memory as fast as it arrived. Dodge didn't sit on this partial win. Within months of the 500's debut, the same engineering group went back to the wind tunnel and got radical. If a flush grille wasn't enough, they'd stop fighting the car's blunt nose altogether and replace it. The result was an 18-inch fiberglass nose cone that transformed the entire front third of the car into a smooth, pointed wedge, completely changing how air moved around the vehicle before it ever reached the windshield. And at the back, instead of just smoothing the rear glass, engineers added a wing towering nearly 2 feet above the trunk lid, mounted on tall struts that put the wing surface up into cleaner, faster-moving air above the turbulent wake off the car's roof. They called it the Charger Daytona, and it arrived just 3 months after the Charger 500 reached showrooms. Where the 500 was a correction, the Daytona was a reinvention. And the results made that difference obvious immediately. In September of 1969, a Charger Daytona became the first NASCAR stock car ever to officially break 200 miles an hour on a closed track. No Charger 500 ever touched that number. The comparison wasn't close, and everyone in racing knew it within a single season. That's the moment the Charger 500 effectively vanished from the story Dodge wanted to tell. Once the Daytona existed, there was no reason for Dodge's marketing, racing program, or dealer floor displays to talk about the car it replaced. The 500 wasn't a failure, it was a stepping stone, and stepping stones don't get remembered once you're standing on the far bank. Dodge built exactly 500 units of the Charger 500 for homologation, compared to 1,920 Charger Daytonas built the same year. The Daytona got the wing, the nose cone, the 200-mile-per-hour record, and 50 years of magazine covers. The 500 got a footnote. There's a real irony buried in this. The Charger 500 is arguably a more honest window into what Dodge's engineers were actually thinking in early 1969. A team working with limited time and a limited budget, taking a production car and fixing exactly the 2 things costing it races, without the luxury of designing an entirely new nose and wing package. It's a case study in engineering under constraint. The Daytona is the unrestrained version, built once Dodge decided a partial fix wasn't going to cut it. Understanding the 500 doesn't diminish the Daytona, it makes the Daytona existence make sense. Without the 500 proving that aerodynamic fixes could work and proving that they still weren't sufficient, there's a real argument Dodge never builds the Daytona in 1969. The collector market has, until relatively recently, mirrored the same overshadowing that happened in 1969. Because the story people know is the Daytona's 200-mile-per-hour record and its instantly recognizable wing and nose silhouette, that's the car buyers chase, and that's the car that commands the bigger number. A well-documented Charger Daytona today typically sells in the range of $75,000 to $130,000, with exceptional numbers-matching examples pushing past that. A Charger 500, despite being rarer in absolute terms and arguably more significant to the actual engineering story, generally trades in the $75,000 to $130,000 range. That's a gap of over $100,000 between 2 cars built the same year, sharing the same platform aimed at solving the exact same problem. One just got there first, and the other got there better. For collectors who understand the full sequence, that gap looks less like a fair reflection of engineering importance and more like a pure name recognition premium. The Charger 500 is authenticated and tracked the same way its more famous sibling is. Chrysler's original homologation paperwork and 1969 NASCAR entry records confirm production numbers and race history, and organizations like the Charger 500 Registry and Mopar authentication specialists like Galen Govier have spent years documenting surviving cars and verifying originality for buyers who know exactly what they're looking at.
There's also a scarcity argument that tends to get lost in the noise. With only 500 units built against 1,920 Daytonas, genuine Charger 500s are, by simple math, the rarer car of the two. And rarity in the muscle car market usually pushes values up, not down. That it hasn't here is entirely a function of story, not supply. Buyers pay for the car they've heard of. The 500 is proof that in the collector world, being first and being famous are two very different things, and only one of them reliably shows up in the sale price. So the next time someone brings up the Charger Daytona, the wing, the nose cone, the 200-mile-per-hour record, it's worth remembering there was a car 3 months earlier that got Dodge most of the way there, quietly, with a borrowed rear window and a straightened-out grille. 500 of them exist because NASCAR's rulebook demanded exactly that many. Most of America never noticed. The ones who did are sitting on one of the more undervalued muscle cars of the entire Aero War era.